A millionaire invites his Maid to a high-profile event intending to make a mockery of her. But she shocks everyone when she walks in wearing his late mother's cherished necklace, unraveling a family connection he didn't expect. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The silver-gray morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Ethan Collins's 45th floor office in Manhattan. He sat behind his mahogany desk, absently tapping his Mont Blanc pen against the invitation list for his upcoming charity gala. His assistant, James Wheeler, stood nearby with an iPad, reviewing the final arrangements. "The guest list is nearly complete, Mr. Collins," James said, his crisp British accent matching his immaculate appearance. "Though I must ask about your unusual request to invite your housekeeper." Ethan leaned back in his leather chair, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Yes, Tanya Johnson. Add her to the list." He picked up a framed photo of his fiancée, Madison Blake, her perfectly styled blonde hair and designer dress embodying everything he thought he wanted in a partner. "Madison and I were discussing how entertaining it would be to see someone like Tanya try to navigate a high-society event." James shifted uncomfortably, but maintained his professional demeanor. "Very well, sir. Should I arrange for the usual car service?" "No," Ethan replied, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. "Let her figure that out herself. Just make sure the invitation reaches her by tomorrow." Across town, in a modest two-bedroom apartment in Queens, Tanya Johnson wiped her hands on her apron after finishing her morning cleaning routine. The sound of mail sliding through the slot drew her attention. Among the bills and advertisements, a thick cream-colored envelope stood out. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, recognizing the Collins family crest embossed in gold. The invitation inside was heavy, expensive paper, announcing the annual charity gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Tanya sat down at her small kitchen table, the invitation looking out of place next to her chipped coffee mug. She reached for the delicate chain around her neck, her fingers finding the familiar shape of the antique silver pendant. The collar had been her mother's prized possession, passed down through generations. Its presence gave her strength when faced with difficult decisions. Tanya knew what this invitation meant. After 3 years of working in the Collins household, she'd witnessed enough conversations to understand that this wasn't a genuine gesture of inclusion. She'd heard the whispered comments, seen the dismissive glances, and endured the subtle jabs at her background. Her first instinct was to decline, to avoid what would surely be an evening of thinly veiled insults and uncomfortable situations. But as she touched the collar again, she remembered her mother's words. Sometimes, standing your ground means walking straight into the storm. The day of the gala arrived with a flurry of activity at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Ethan stood at the top of the grand staircase, watching as New York's elite arrived in their finest attire. Madison clung to his arm, her red Valentino gown drawing admiring glances. "I can't wait to see what your little cleaning lady wears," Madison whispered, her perfect teeth showing in what could barely be called a smile. "Do you think she'll show up in her uniform?" Ethan chuckled, though something in his stomach twisted uncomfortably. He pushed the feeling aside, focusing instead on greeting arriving guests. Every few minutes, his eyes would drift to the entrance, anticipating Tanya's arrival and the entertainment it would surely provide. The evening lights cast a warm glow over the museum's facade as more guests arrived. Ethan checked his watch repeatedly, wondering if perhaps Tanya had thought better of accepting the invitation. Part of him hoped she wouldn't show up, saving him from what he was beginning to realize might be a cruel gesture. But as the evening wore on, something unexpected happened. With each passing moment, Ethan found himself growing increasingly aware of his own motivations. The weight of his planned humiliation of Tanya began to feel less like entertainment and more like a burden. Yet, he remained at his post, playing the role of the confident host while internally questioning his own character. The grand hall of the Metropolitan Museum fell into a peculiar hush as Tanya Johnson appeared at the entrance. She stood for a moment, framed by the massive doorway, wearing a simple but elegant black dress that fit her perfectly. It wasn't designer. She'd found it at a consignment shop and altered it herself, but it carried a timeless grace that made labels irrelevant. The antique silver collar rested against her collarbone, catching the light from the crystal chandeliers. Its intricate design drew attention not just to the piece itself, but to the quiet dignity with which Tanya carried herself. Her dark hair was swept up in a classic style that emphasized her high cheekbones and determined eyes. Ethan Collins felt his breath catch in his throat. The woman walking down the marble steps bore little resemblance to the efficient housekeeper who moved quietly through his home. Gone was the practical uniform and sensible shoes, replaced by someone who seemed to belong in these halls more than many of the guests who frequented them. Madison's fingers dug into Ethan's arm. "Well, well," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Look who cleaned up nicely. Though that necklace looks like something from a thrift store. Probably costume jewelry." Several nearby guests turned to look, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed disdain. Tanya approached the bottom of the stairs, her movements measured and controlled. She'd spent hours practicing walking in heels, determined not to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her stumble. "Mr. Collins," she said, her voice clear and steady as she reached them. "Ms. Blake, thank you for the invitation." Her words were perfect, polite but not subservient, acknowledging their status without diminishing her own. Ethan found himself struggling to maintain his planned air of condescension. The woman before him carried herself with an innate elegance that had nothing to do with designer labels or social status. "Welcome, Ms. Johnson," he managed, surprised by the formality in his own voice. Madison stepped forward, her smile sharp as a knife. "That's such an interesting necklace, Tanya. Did you borrow it from someone?" The question was designed to embarrass, to highlight the assumed gap between Tanya and the other guests. "No, Ms. Blake," Tanya replied, her hand rising briefly to touch the collar. "It's a family heirloom." She offered no further explanation, no defensive justification of its worth or origin. The simple statement hung in the air, carrying more weight than any elaborate explanation could have. As Tanya moved past them into the main gallery, Ethan found his eyes following her. She navigated the room with unexpected grace, pausing to examine artwork rather than immediately seeking out the refreshments as he'd expected. Several guests looked at her with obvious curiosity, their initial dismissiveness giving way to something closer to interest. The evening light streaming through the museum's windows created an almost ethereal effect, and Ethan noticed how the collar seemed to glow against Tanya's skin. There was something familiar about it, something that tugged at the edges of his memory, but he couldn't quite place it. Madison's voice cut through his thoughts. "Really, darling, you didn't need to invite the help to make some sort of statement about inclusivity. It's rather heavy-handed, don't you think?" She laughed, the sound brittle and hollow. Out in the elegant space. But Ethan barely heard her. His attention remained fixed on Tanya as she stopped before a painting, her head tilted slightly as she studied the artwork. The gesture was so natural, so genuine, that it made the practiced poses of the other guests seem artificial in comparison. For the first time that evening, Ethan felt a deep discomfort that had nothing to do with social awkwardness and everything to do with his own preconceptions. The cruel entertainment he'd anticipated had transformed into something else entirely, a mirror reflecting his own prejudices back at him. As other guests began to cluster around Tanya, drawn by her unexpected presence and composure, Ethan realized his carefully planned evening of amusement had taken an unexpected turn. The question was no longer how Tanya would fit into his world, but how his world would adjust to her presence. The evening progressed into its second hour as guests gathered around various conversation areas in the grand hall. Tanya found herself near a group of wealthy patrons discussing the merits of inherited wealth versus earned success. She stood quietly, sipping water from a crystal glass, listening as their voices grew increasingly condescending. "The problem with new money," declared a silver-haired woman in diamonds, "is that they lack the refinement that comes from generations of cultural education." Several heads nodded in agreement, their jewelry catching the light. Tanya cleared her throat softly. "Pardon my interruption, but refinement isn't inherited. It's learned through experience and empathy." Her voice was calm but firm, carrying across the small group. "My grandmother cleaned houses her entire life, yet she taught me more about genuine grace than any finishing school could." The group fell silent, several guests turning to look at her with surprise. A man in an expensive tuxedo raised an eyebrow. "And you are?" "Tanya Johnson. I work for Mr. Collins." She met their stares directly. "I've observed that true elegance has little to do with wealth and everything to do with how we treat others." Across the room, Ethan had been watching the interaction while pretending to listen to Madison's complaints about the catering. His attention was repeatedly drawn to the silver collar around Tanya's neck. Something about its design nagged at his memory, a pattern he should recognize but couldn't quite place. "That necklace," murmured an elderly guest near him, her voice carrying just far enough. "I haven't seen it in years. Elizabeth used to wear it at every important occasion." Ethan turned sharply. "Elizabeth? Your mother, dear boy. Don't you remember? That collar was her signature piece. She always said it represented everything she valued about heritage. Not the monetary worth, but the stories it carried." The revelation hit Ethan like a physical blow. Memories flooded back. His mother wearing that same collar at charity events, handling it with reverence, telling him it would someday belong to someone who understood its true value. He'd forgotten about it entirely after her passing, assuming it had been stored away with her other jewelry. He moved through the crowd toward Tanya, questions burning in his mind. As he approached, he heard her speaking about the importance of preserving history while embracing progress. The guests around her were listening with genuine interest, their initial dismissiveness replaced by engagement. "Ms. Johnson," he interrupted, his voice rougher than intended. "That collar. May I ask where you got it?" Tanya's hand rose to touch the silver piece, her expression guarded. "It belonged to my mother," she said carefully. "She received it from her employer many years ago, a woman who believed that true worth transcends social boundaries." "Was her name Elizabeth?" Ethan asked, his throat tight. The question hung in the air between them. Tanya's eyes widened slightly as understanding dawned. "Elizabeth Collins, S.H." He confirmed softly. "She gave it to my mother, Maria, who had worked for her for 15 years. She said my mother exemplified the qualities the collar represented: dignity, strength, and grace under pressure." The surrounding guests watched the exchange with growing interest. Madison appeared at Ethan's elbow, her face tight with annoyance. "Darling, surely you're not suggesting this piece actually belonged to your family?" But Ethan barely heard her. He was lost in memories of his mother, remembering conversations he'd ignored about valuing character over status. Elizabeth Collins had been known for her unconventional views about class and dignity, often shocking her social circle with her treatment of household staff as equals. "She worked in our summer house," Tanya continued, her voice steady but emotional. "Your mother taught my mother to read English, encouraged her to take night classes. The collar was a graduation gift when she earned her GED." Ethan stared at the piece, seeing it with new eyes. The intricate silver work, the delicate patterns that had always seemed so familiar. They were part of his history, but they now belonged to a story far more meaningful than mere inheritance. The revelation created a palpable shift in the atmosphere. Guests who had been dismissive of Tanya earlier now looked at her with new interest, while others appeared uncomfortable, perhaps recognizing their own prejudices in the unfolding story. Madison's face flushed red as she watched the gathering crowd around Tanya and Ethan. She grabbed a champagne flute from a passing server and drained it in one gulp before stalking toward them. Her designer heels clicked aggressively against the marble floor. "This is absolutely ridiculous," Madison announced loudly, positioning herself between Ethan and Tanya. "Are we really going to stand here and believe that this cleaning woman somehow has a legitimate connection to the Collins family?" Her voice carried across the room, drawing even more attention to the scene. Tanya remained composed, though her fingers tightened slightly around her water glass. "The legitimacy of the collar's history isn't up for debate, Ms. Blake. Its story is well documented." Several of the older guests nodded in agreement, particularly those who had known Elizabeth Collins. One elderly gentleman stepped forward, adjusting his glasses. "I remember Elizabeth wearing that piece. She was quite vocal about her intentions to pass it along to someone who embodied its values rather than someone who would simply lock it away in a vault." Madison's laugh was sharp and brittle. Oh, how convenient. And I suppose next we'll discover she's secretly a lost Collins heir? She turned to the surrounding crowd. Don't you all see what's happening here? This woman shows up wearing what she claims is a family heirloom, and you're all falling for it. Ethan had been quiet, lost in memories of his mother. But at Madison's words, something shifted in his expression. That's enough, Madison. His voice was low but firm. Enough? Darling, I'm trying to protect your family's reputation. This woman clearly planned this whole thing. She's probably been waiting for the perfect moment to dash. I said enough. Ethan's voice cut through the murmurs of the crowd. He turned to face Tanya, his expression softening. My mother, she used to talk about dignity, about how it wasn't something you could buy or inherit. It had to be earned through actions and character. Tanya met his gaze steadily. She told my mother the same thing. The day she gave her the collar, she said that true nobility isn't found in bank accounts or family trees. It's found in how we treat others, especially those society tells us are beneath us. The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. He remembered his mother trying to teach him similar lessons, lessons he dismissed as idealistic and impractical. Standing there now, faced with the evidence of his own prejudices, he felt eply ashamed. Madison wasn't finished. She reached out, as if to touch the collar. Well, if it's really a Collins family piece, perhaps it should be returned to its rightful owner. Tanya stepped back smoothly, avoiding Madison's grasp. The rightful owner is wearing it, Ms. Blake. Elizabeth Collins made that clear when she gifted it to my mother, complete with notarized documentation. Her voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the surface. Documentation that could easily be forged. Madison snapped, her composure cracking. An elderly woman in the crowd spoke up. I was there the day Elizabeth gave Maria that collar. I signed as a witness. This young woman is telling the truth. The confrontation had drawn nearly every guest's attention. The room was silent except for the soft classical music playing in the background and the occasional clink of glasses. Ethan looked between Madison and Tanya, seeing them both clearly for perhaps the first time. My mother, he said slowly, always dreamed of seeing me with someone who understood the true meaning of strength and dignity. He turned to Madison, his expression hardening. Someone who lifted others up instead of tearing them down. Madison's face contorted with rage and embarrassment. You can't be serious. You're choosing to believe this servant over your fiancé. I'm choosing to honor my mother's values, Ethan replied quietly. Values I've ignored for far too long. The moment hung in the air, heavy with significance. Tanya stood tall, the collar gleaming at her throat, while Madison's perfect facade crumbled under the weight of her own actions. The gathered crowd watched as years of social pretense and prejudice began to crack, revealing the truth beneath the polished surface of their world. After the confrontation, Tanya found a quiet corner near one of the museum's massive windows. Her hands shook slightly as she pulled out her phone, seeing 3 missed calls from the nursing home where her grandmother stayed. Stepping behind a large pillar, she returned the call. Abuela, she whispered into the phone. I saw your calls. Is everything okay? Her grandmother's voice came through, warm and weathered. Mi amor, I wanted to know how the gala is going. I've been praying for you since you left. A pause, then. Are you wearing your mother's collar? Tanya touched the silver piece at her throat. Yes, and Abuela, they recognized it. The son of Mrs. Collins. He remembered it. Her voice caught. Everything's changing so fast. Ah, her grandmother sighed. Elizabeth always said that collar would build bridges. Even when your mother doubted, Elizabeth insisted it would someday connect worlds. A wheezing cough interrupted her words. Remember what your mother always said. Dignity isn't given or taken, it's maintained, Tanya finished, wiping a tear from her cheek. I wish she could see this moment. She sees me more. She sees. Across the room, Ethan stood alone on the balcony, his bow tie loosened, staring out at the city lights. Madison's words still rang in his ears, but louder still were the memories suddenly flooding back. His mother's gentle corrections when he'd make dismissive comments about their staff, her persistent attempts to teach him about true worth. He remembered a specific morning, years ago. He complained about having to eat breakfast with the household staff present. Elizabeth had set down her coffee cup and looked at him with disappointment. "One day, Ethan," she'd said, "you'll understand that the measure of a person isn't in their wallet or their wardrobe. It's in their heart, their actions, their dignity in the face of those who would deny it." He hadn't understood then. Or rather, he'd chosen not to understand. The sound of footsteps made him turn. James, his assistant, approached with a concerned expression. "Sir, I found some things you should see." He held out a tablet displaying old photographs. "These were in our mother's digital archives." Ethan's breath caught. The first photo showed his mother at a graduation ceremony, her arm around a younger woman who had to be Tanya's mother. Both were beaming, and the silver collar gleamed at the graduate's throat. More photos followed: holiday celebrations, birthday parties, moments where the line between employer and employee had blurred into something closer to family. "There's more," James said quietly. "Your mother kept detailed journals. She wrote extensively about her hopes for you, her concern about the influence of certain social circles on your values." Ethan held up a hand, unable to bear more at that moment. The weight of his mother's disappointed hopes pressed down on him. He'd spent years cultivating an image of success that she would have seen as failure. Meanwhile, Tanya ended her call with her grandmother and found herself facing a group of guests who had apparently been waiting to speak with her. Among them was an elderly woman who'd known Elizabeth Collins. "You remind me so much of your mother," the woman said softly. "Maria had that same quiet strength." Elizabeth saw it immediately. That's why she took such an interest in her education. Tanya smiled, though her eyes were damp. "Mom used to say Mrs. Collins gave her more than an education. She gave her the confidence to believe she deserved one." The conversation continued, with other guests sharing memories of Elizabeth Collins and her unconventional views on social equality. Each story highlighted how far Ethan had strayed from his mother's path, while Tanya and her mother had embodied everything Elizabeth had valued. As the evening continued, the atmosphere in the gallery had shifted dramatically. The usual superficial chatter had been replaced by more meaningful conversations about privilege, opportunity, and the true meaning of dignity. Tanya's presence had sparked something unexpected, a moment of collective reflection in a world that rarely paused for self-examination. Madison's absence from the main gallery was conspicuous, but few seemed to notice or care. The evening had taken on a different tone, with guests breaking into smaller groups, engaging in conversations that went deeper than the usual social pleasantries. Ethan found himself moving through the crowd with new awareness. He caught fragments of conversations about privilege, about his mother's legacy, about the meaning of true class. Each comment seemed to chip away at the facade he'd maintained for so long. He spotted Tanya standing near a Renaissance painting, deep in conversation with a museum curator about the significance of symbolism in art. Her knowledge shouldn't have surprised him. He'd seen her reading art books during her lunch breaks, but he'd never bothered to wonder why. Madison suddenly reappeared, her makeup freshly touched up, a forced smile on her face. She approached Ethan with determined steps. "Darling, we need to make an announcement about our engagement. It's the perfect moment to redirect everyone's attention to something more appropriate." Ethan looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. The perfectly coordinated outfit, the practiced smile, the calculated movements, it all seemed hollow now. "No, Madison, there won't be any announcement. Don't be ridiculous. This little drama with your housekeeper has gone on long enough. We need to remind everyone why they're really here." "Why are they really here, Madison?" Ethan's voice was quiet but firm. "To celebrate wealth? To reinforce class divisions? To make sure everyone knows their proper place?" Madison's smile faltered. "To support your charity foundation, of course, though I've always said we should be more selective about our beneficiaries." "The foundation my mother started," Ethan corrected her. "The one dedicated to educational opportunities for domestic workers and their children. The one you've been trying to redirect toward more suitable causes." ACR. OSS the room. Tanya excused herself from her conversation, sensing the tension building between Ethan and Madison. She began moving toward the exit, not wanting to be the cause of more conflict. But Ethan saw her leaving and moved quickly to intercept her. "Please don't go," he said, catching up to her near a marble column. I need to talk to you about the foundation, about my mother's vision. Madison followed, her heels clicking aggressively on the floor. Ethan, you can't be serious. This has gone far enough. But Ethan continued speaking to Tanya, as if Madison hadn't interrupted. My mother believed in creating bridges between worlds. She saw education as the key to breaking down barriers. The collar you're wearing, it wasn't just jewelry to her. It was a symbol of that belief. Tanya touched the collar reflexively. Mrs. Collins helped my mother earn her GED, then supported her through community college. She believed everyone deserved the chance to grow, to learn, to rise. Stop it. Madison's voice rose sharply. This isn't about some sentimental jewelry or your mother's misguided charity. This is about maintaining standards, about protecting our way of life. Several nearby guests turned to stare. Ethan watched as Madison's carefully constructed persona cracked further, revealing the ugliness beneath. He felt a deep shame at having been attracted to her superficial perfection, at having chosen her as a partner. Our way of life, he repeated. You mean a life of exclusion? Of judgment? Of treating people as less than human because they work for a living? He shook his head. That's not the life I want anymore. Tanya started to step away again, but Ethan gently caught her hand. Please stay. The foundation needs people who understand its true purpose, who share my mother's vision. The touch was brief, professional, but it carried weight. Around them, the other guests had fallen silent, watching this crucial moment unfold. Some nodded in approval, while others shifted uncomfortably, perhaps seeing reflections of their own prejudices in Madison's behavior. The string quartet in the corner began playing a new piece, something classical and profound that seemed to underscore the gravity of the moment. The evening had transformed from a simple charity gala into something more significant, a turning point not just for Ethan and Tanya, but for the entire social circle that had gathered there. Madison stood alone, her perfect world crumbling around her, while a new understanding began to take shape between Ethan and Tanya, one based not on class or status, but on shared values and genuine respect. Madison retreated to the ladies' room, her hands shaking as she pulled out her phone. After several quick texts, she emerged with renewed determination. Her well-manicured fingers scrolled through her phone's gallery, stopping on an old photo she'd saved months ago, one that would serve her purpose perfectly. Meanwhile, the gala had entered its final phase. Waiters circulated with champagne for the traditional closing toasts, and the museum's lights dimmed slightly, creating an intimate atmosphere for the evening's concluding speeches. Tanya stood near the edge of the crowd, listening as various board members discussed the foundation's future. The collar felt warm against her skin, almost as if it carried its own energy. She noticed several older patrons glancing her way with approving smiles, remembering Elizabeth Collins and her progressive views. Ethan had taken his position near the podium, preparing to give his closing remarks. But before he could begin, Madison strode purposefully to the front of the room, grabbing a microphone from the stand. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice carrying across the hushed room, "before we conclude this evening, I have something important to share." She gestured to one of the servers, who began distributing tablets to key guests. "What you're about to see is proof of a calculate. Id deception." Tanya felt her stomach drop as she saw the image appearing on the tablets, a grainy security camera photo showing someone who looked like her mother selling jewelry at a pawn shop. The date stamp was from 15 years ago. "As you can see," Madison continued, her voice dripping with false concern, "the famous collar has quite a different history than what we've been led to believe. This photo shows it being sold for cash, hardly the actions of someone who received it as a meaningful gift." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some guests began to look at Tanya with renewed suspicion, while others appeared confused, looking between the photo and the collar she wore. Ethan stepped forward, reaching for the microphone, but Madison held it away. "I'm not finished," she said sharply. "I've also discovered that our uninvited guest has quite a history of working her way into wealthy households, gaining trust, and then, that's enough." Ethan's voice cut through the room, even without the microphone. "Madison, stop this immediately." But Tanya had already moved forward, her head held high. "May I?" she asked quietly, holding out her hand for the microphone. After a tense moment, Ethan took it from Madison and handed it to her. "The photo you're looking at," Tanya began, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "shows my mother at Henderson's jewelry repair, where she took the collar for restoration after its clasp was damaged. Mrs. Collins insisted on paying for the repair herself, but Mom wanted to maintain its dignity by paying her own way. She reached into her small clutch and pulled out a folded document, the original repair receipt, preserved along with other papers related to the collar's history. The date stamp on that surveillance photo matches the receipt exactly. My mother documented everything about the collar's history, knowing that someday someone might question its legitimacy." The elderly woman who had earlier confirmed the collar's provenance stepped forward. "I remember that repair. Elizabeth was so proud of Maria for insisting on paying for it herself. She said it proved she'd chosen the right person to inherit the piece." Madison's face flushed red. "But what about her other positions? The other wealthy families? You mean my mother's work as a consultant?" Tanya replied calmly. "After earning her degree, with Mrs. Collins's support, she started a business helping domestic workers advance their careers through education. She worked with several families in this room, helping their staff achieve their dreams of better lives." The tide in the room began to turn. Several guests nodded, remembering Maria Johnson's work. Others looked at Madison with growing disapproval, recognizing the deliberate attempt to twist innocent facts into something scandalous. Ethan moved to stand beside Tanya. "My mother kept detailed records of everything," he said, "including her hopes for how the foundation would continue her work helping domestic workers advance through education, exactly the kind of work Maria Johnson pioneered." Madison stood alone at the podium, her carefully orchestrated moment of triumph transformed into a very public failure. The tablets displaying her evidence now served only to highlight her own prejudice and desperation. Madison, desperate to salvage the situation, grabbed another microphone. "You're all being manipulated." Her voice cracked with frustration. "This woman shows up wearing a convenient piece of jewelry, spins a pretty story about education and dignity, and suddenly everyone forgets who they are, who we are." Tanya stepped forward, the collar catching the light. "That's exactly what Mrs. Collins wanted us to do. Forget who we think we are and remember who we could be." Her voice carried naturally, without need for amplification. "This collar isn't about jewelry or status. It's about breaking barriers." She lifted her chin, addressing the entire room. "When Mrs. Collins gave this to my mother, she said something I'll never forget. This collar has been in my family for generations, passed down through women who were expected to be nothing more than ornaments in society. I'm giving it to you, Maria, because you represent what I wish those women had been allowed to become: strong, educated, independent." The room fell silent. Even the waiters stopped moving, caught in the gravity of the moment. Ethan moved to the podium, his expression transformed by understanding. "My mother tried to teach me these lessons for years, about how real worth isn't inherited. It's earned through actions, through character, through how we treat others." He turned to face the crowd. "Look at us. Look at what we've become. We gather at these events, congratulating ourselves on our charity while treating the people who serve us as invisible." Madison attempted one final attack. "Oh, how touching. And I suppose next you'll tell us you're in love with her? The noble millionaire and the humble servant." "No, Madison," Ethan replied firmly. "This isn't a fairy tale about love conquering social barriers. It's about something more fundamental: human dignity. The kind my mother understood and tried to protect. The kind you've just demonstrated you completely lack." Several of the older guests began to applaud, followed quickly by others. The sound built until it filled the grand hall, not just approval for Tanya's dignity under fire, but recognition of a deeper truth being spoken. Tanya remained composed, though her eyes glistened. Mrs. Collins believed education could bridge any divide. "She saw potential in my mother when others saw only a housekeeper. The foundation she created wasn't about charity, it was about opportunity." An elderly board member stepped forward, "Which is why, as chairman of the Collins Foundation, I'm pleased to announce that we'll be expanding our educational support program for domestic workers and their families." He smiled at Tanya. And we'd like you to head the initiative, Ms. Johnson, carrying on both your mother's and Elizabeth Collins's legacy." Madison laughed bitterly. "This is absurd. You're going to let this woman run a multi-million-dollar foundation because she has a nice necklace and a sob story?" "No," Ethan interjected. "She'll run it because she understands its true purpose. Because she lives the values it represents." He turned to address the crowd again. "My mother's foundation wasn't created to make us feel good about ourselves once a year at a fancy gala. It was created to change lives, to break down barriers, to prove that dignity and worth aren't bound by social class." The atmosphere in the room had shifted completely. Guests who had earlier whispered behind their hands about Tanya's presence now approached her with genuine interest. The collar at her throat no longer seemed like a piece of jewelry. It had become a symbol of transformation, not just for her or Ethan, but for everyone present. Madison stood alone, her perfect world crumbling around her, while a new understanding began to take root in the room. One that would reshape not just the foundation, but the entire social structure it served. The gala's formal program had ended, but guests lingered, clustered in groups that ignored the usual social hierarchies. Old money mingled with foundation staff. Board members engaged in earnest conversation with household employees who had been invited as potential program beneficiaries. Near the grand staircase, Tanya found herself surrounded by a group of domestic workers who had been watching the evening's events unfold from the periphery. A gray-haired housekeeper stepped forward, tears in her eyes. "I worked with your mother," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "She helped me get my associate's degree in accounting. Now my daughter's in medical school." The woman reached out to touch the collar reverently. "Maria would be so proud to see you standing here tonight." Others shared similar stories. Lives transformed by the quiet work of Maria Johnson and Elizabeth Collins's foundation. Each testimony added weight to the evening's revelations, proving that the collar's symbolism went far beyond its silver and gems. Across the room, Ethan was engaged in an intense discussion with the foundation's board members. The usual power dynamics had shifted. He was no longer the young millionaire playing at philanthropy, but a man finally embracing his mother's vision. "We need to completely restructure our approach," he was saying. "No more token scholarships or annual galas. We need comprehensive programs, mentorship opportunities, real pathways to advancement." Madison had retreated to a corner with her remaining allies, her voice carrying just far enough to be heard. "This is social suicide. He's destroying everything we've built. And for what? Some idealistic fantasy about equality." But her words found little traction. The evening had stripped away pretenses, leaving raw truth exposed. Several of her former friends had already approached Tanya to apologize for their earlier behavior, some even sharing their own stories of household staff who had become like family. One of the museum's security guards, an older man who had watched countless galas from the shadows, approached Tanya quietly. "My daughter," he said softly, "she's brilliant. Always reading, always learning, but college seemed impossible." He hesitated. "With this new program?" "Give me her information," Tanya replied warmly. "This is exactly what Mrs. Collins wanted, breaking down barriers, one person at a time." The moment crystallized the evening's transformation. The guard's question would have been unthinkable hours earlier, just as Tanya's answer would have seemed impossible. Several prominent donors were already pledging additional support, inspired by the renewed sense of purpose. The foundation's potential had suddenly expanded beyond its original scope, promising to affect not just individual lives but entire communities. An elderly board member who had known Elizabeth Collins for decades watched the scene with satisfaction. "Elizabeth always said the right person would come along," she remarked to no one in particular. "Someone who would understand that true change requires more than money. It requires heart." Ethan found himself repeatedly drawn to Tanya's presence, not from attraction, but from recognition of a shared purpose. The embarrassment he had planned for her had instead become his own awakening, stripping away years of accumulated prejudice and pretense. As the evening drew to a close, the impact of what had transpired began to settle over the assembly. This wasn't just another charity gala where the wealthy congratulated themselves on their generosity. This was a moment of genuine transformation, catalyzed by a silver collar and the courage of those who understood its true value. The usual artifice of such events had been replaced by something authentic. Guests departed not with the usual vague promises of support, but with specific commitments to action. The Foundation's future had been reshaped in ways that would honor both Elizabeth Collins's vision and Maria Johnson's legacy. The morning after the gala, Ethan sat in his office, surrounded by his mother's journals and Foundation documents that James had retrieved from storage. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from Madison, all of which he ignored. The morning papers and social media were ablaze with coverage of the previous night's events. Madison had already launched her counterattack. Gossip columns carried anonymous sources, suggesting Tanya had orchestrated everything, painting her as a skilled manipulator who had planned this for years. But these attempts at character assassination fell flat against the mountain of evidence emerging about Maria Johnson's work and Elizabeth Collins's deliberate mentorship. Ethan's phone rang, this Tim. It was his family's longtime lawyer. "Mr. Collins, I've found something you need to see immediately." Within an hour, the lawyer arrived with a sealed envelope, yellowed with age, marked with his mother's handwriting, to be opened when the caller finds its way home. Inside was a letter, written in Elizabeth Collins's elegant hand. "My dearest Ethan, if you're reading this, then the caller has finally revealed its truth to you. I gave it to Maria knowing that someday it would bridge the gap I feared was growing in your heart. The Foundation was never meant to be just another charity. It was meant to be a testament to the dignity of every human being." Madison's face appeared on the morning news shows, ready to share her shocking revelations about the Collins Foundation. But before she could speak, the host announced breaking news. Documented evidence of her attempts to redirect Foundation funds, manipulate grant applications, and systematically exclude qualified candidates who didn't fit her vision of appropriate recipients. The evidence had come from James, Ethan's assistant, who had quietly documented years of Madison's interference. "Your mother asked me to watch over the Foundation's true purpose," he explained when Ethan questioned him. "I've kept every email, every altered document, every instance of discrimination." Tanya arrived at the Foundation's offices for her first official day, still wearing the collar. She carried a worn leather portfolio, her mother's detailed records of every life touched by the Foundation, every dream supported, every barrier broken. As she set up in what had been Elizabeth Collins's office, a steady stream of staff members came to share their own stories of how Maria Johnson had influenced their lives. Madison made one final attempt at revenge, calling an emergency board meeting to challenge Tanya's appointment. But as she began her carefully prepared speech, she was interrupted by the arrival of several prominent society figures, people she had counted as allies. "We've reviewed the Foundation's original mission statement," one of them announced, "and we've compared it to its current operations. The disparity is shocking. Ms. Johnson's appointment isn't just appropriate. It's essential to returning the Foundation to its true purpose." Ethan finally confronted Madison in the Foundation's lobby, where she waited with her usual air of entitled expectation. "It's over," he said simply. "Not just our engagement, but your involvement with the Foundation, your influence in our social circle, everything. You're choosing them over me? Over your own class?" Madison's voice rose hysterically. "I'm choosing my mother's legacy," Ethan replied. "I'm choosing to be the person she tried to raise me to be." He turned to leave, then paused. "You know what the worst part is, Madison? You never understood that real class has nothing to do with money." News of Madison's attempted manipulation spread quickly through their social circle. Her carefully cultivated image crumbled as more people came forward with stories of her cruelty and prejudice. Within weeks, she had left New York, her social capital completely depleted. The Foundation flourished under its new leadership. Tanya's practical experience combined with Ethan's resources created a powerful force for change. The collar that had sparked everything remained a symbol, but the real transformation was in the lives being changed, the barriers being broken, the dignity being restored. 1 year later, at the next gala, the guest list looked very different. Domestic workers sat alongside their employers, students who had received Foundation support mingled with donors, and the usual social barriers had dissolved into something new and more meaningful. Ethan and Tanya stood together at the podium, not as a romantic couple, but as partners in a greater cause. Their relationship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. The collar gleamed at Tanya's throat, no longer a source of controversy, but a reminder of how far they had all come. My mother once told me, Ethan addressed the crowd, that true worth reveals itself in how we treat those society tells us are beneath us. It took a silver collar and an extraordinary woman to help me understand what she meant. The story of the collar became legend in New York society, not as a tale of forbidden love, but as a reminder that real transformation often comes from unexpected places, and that dignity, once recognized, can never be denied.